Welcome to Open Mind Integration. This is Christopher Gunlock. This is part 4 of the Psychedelic Harm Reduction course, Psychedelic Psychology. And be sure to check out the whole course, all 12 parts, available at openmindintegration.com. And the disclaimer. So in this class, we'll be covering a few different models from modern psychology that I feel really help to create a well-rounded understanding of how psychedelics work with the mind and consciousness and its relation to the ego and the different parts of our psyche. So please enjoy. So I'd like to start with Carl Jung because I think he did a great job of encapsulating the dynamic between our unconscious, which is very much what gets exposed with psychedelics, and our beliefs, our behavior, our just ways of perceiving life and reality itself, in a way that I think was very practical and applicable to the nature of integration. So this is a little outline of what we'll be covering. So I'll start with this concept of the internal manifesting the external and these dynamics between the two. And by internal, I generally do mean the unconscious, but not necessarily unconscious because, we can expose it and become aware of it depending on what state of consciousness we're in. Psychedelics, being one of those. And Carl Jung did a great job of bringing a level of importance and relevance to this. I really like this quote about imagination here on the right. It's really fundamental to the psychedelic experience because the parts of the psychedelic experience that can be the most surprising, the most illuminating and inspiring and even terrifying are this internal, unconscious, the things below the surface. But this importance on the internal is there because I do notice that there's a high correlation between the people that are harmed by psychedelics and the people that take it the least seriously. And you'll see in some of my other classes this this lesson about just take it seriously, invest in it, put some importance and relevance into it, and that is what translates into beneficial results. It's really, that's the main concept I would put forward in terms of how to take psychedelics in a healthy way. Some nuances here, though. The internal contains our egoic constructions, memories, instincts, coping mechanism. This is, again, oftentimes in our unconscious, but at the very least, as we'll talk about later, what's below the ego, what the ego is covering up. And so there's so much under the surface. It's very much that iceberg analogy. What we're just normally aware of is really just a small part of the story. So I really appreciate the Jungian illumination on this internal part of us. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be unconscious, because when we have tools like psychedelics or even meditation or the many other ways to access these altered states of consciousness, the unconscious becomes accessible, frankly, and I think that is a potentially beneficial thing to a great degree. So we'll be talking more about this concept of what we do and create as externally is a manifestation of the internal, and using this model of the internal being more at the basis of what's happening in our reality externally. All right, fear. Fear is the ever foreboding feeling, the experience that taunts us in any state of consciousness, really. But in the psychedelic experience, most definitely, this is one of the most common deterrence that I would say that I encounter amongst people that are considering to take psychedelics. It's the thing that gives people the most anxiety, just a fear of something, anything, many, many different things. Even fear of just not knowing, the uncertainty, as I often refer to. But it is so important, and Carl Jung does a great job of shedding light on this. It's so important to respect fear, to understand that it has a very, very distinct purpose, and that it's not something to just push away from us, to avoid, but that really, in many cases, especially in the modern lifestyle of avoidance and distraction, in many cases, fear is where our biggest answers and solutions are to our problems. Behind those fears, oftentimes, are the things that we need the most. And psychedelics do such a great job of really making that understanding a conscious understanding. So I'm kind of bombarding you with a bunch of little little quotes here, but my hope though is that even if you only read some of these, it shows really where this can be useful. That fear is not necessarily a thing just to get away from, but that it sometimes is a beacon of light, a sign of where maybe somewhere on the other side of that fear is the thing that you're actually looking for. One thing I really enjoy is you always become the thing you fight the most, and this is something I think we see a lot of in our society right now. Is there's a lot of folks that they've got a reason to be angry, to be to want to lash out, antagonize, create an enemy, to join a cause against something. But while there's always a reason to rise up and face that which oppresses you, it's good to remember that if you give into it too much, eventually it will swallow you up and you will become it. So there's a balance there, and I think the fear of that thing you avoid is oftentimes what is at the base of those patterns. So another very, very key concept that I'm very glad that Carl Jung has championed is this reminder that we can choose our reality. And I want to preface this idea with an understanding that there are two sides to this. On one, yes, we can choose our reality, but on the other, there are also other people in our lives and other forces that are choosing their reality, and that sometimes we can get entangled in other people's reality. And this is, the phenomenon of oppression and abuse and various forms of trauma that can be inflicted from person to person. So I don't want to negate that here, because it's often the argument that comes up in opposition to this. But the reality is that it's both. It's both. We should never give up completely our autonomy, our sense of agency, that we do have a role in crafting our experience of life, our experience of reality. Because the truth is, if we truly embrace our conscious ability to make decisions that manifest a certain kind of lifestyle, then it makes it very easy for oppressive forces to take control and to have our reality be chosen for us. So this is just a reminder that there is always at least some choice in this. One example is really the one that I think is easiest to criticize, and that is the act of suffering. If you are suffering, surely there's a reason, there's something that's affecting you. The only question is that coming externally, or is there some element of your own internal progression of that. And I think there is always at least some. So identifying that is a really, really efficient first step at making change. So the key here is the coping mechanisms, identifying how we've chosen to protect ourselves from further trauma. Is a very automatic mechanism to learning how to do that. It's just that sometimes that automatic mechanism that creates these coping, these ways of coping can become maladaptive. At the very least, there is always a point that if we hang on to these coping mechanisms for long enough, they will become maladaptive because the source of trauma and suffering, it will go away eventually, right? I mean, things change, as circumstances change. And so much of what people are suffering from with PTSD, chronic anxiety, depression, is just a leftover coping mechanism from something that happened to them, but is no longer present. It's just changing that becomes the hard part, and that's really where psychedelics can play a major role. Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. A great quote. I'm glad I found this one. It brings forth two really key concepts. One of them we've kind of been elaborating on already, the difference between the internal and the external, the conscious and the unconscious. But more importantly, the dynamic between them, the idea that the contents of the conscious press upward from the unconscious, that there's this like bottom up effect. The unconscious is driving what is in our conscious reality. And so that necessitates the awareness of what is happening in the unconscious, the ability to process that, to reflect on that, and to integrate it. So that's really what we're talking about when we say psychedelic integration, because again, the psychedelics do a great job at exposing the unconscious. And so most people that I find that are seeking out psychedelics for beneficial reasons, it's because for one reason or another they have become unintegrated. One reason or another, they've avoided, distracted, repressed, oppressed that which is in the unconscious and needs to be integrated. Numbing out from addictions, escaping from, using things like your work or kind of exciting, ego gratifying activities do a great job of suppressing the unconscious. I mean, the ego is essentially the protection mechanisms around the unconscious, as we'll get to that in a little bit. But doing this for long enough will create these problems. Because we're essentially acting things out that we are unconscious of. And so the longer we do that, the more the ego reinforces it. Whatever that is in the conscious realm, the ego is going to take that and create an identity out of it. It's going to guide its decisions, direct its executive functioning to reinforce that, to make that as real as possible, no matter how rooted it might be in something fallible or unsustainable. So this is a great lesson for us as we dive into this realm of psychedelics. All right, so here we go into the Freudian universe. The concept of the ego was really made popular there in his teachings, and we've already been referring to it. It's very much that kind of like external representation of you. It's how other people perceive you. It's your mask. Very figuratively, but sometimes literally. The the form of yourself, the sense of identity that you want other people to see. And really, it goes pretty deep. It has to, because in order to present yourself in a certain way, you have to kind of believe it. And your habits have to reflect it. Your ways of perceiving things, because humans are very perceptive. When you're face to face with somebody, it's very very easy to kind of see what is really driving things. And the ego is extremely well practiced in that. So what drives this? Well, the sum of your experiences, memories, your interactions with people. Every time your ego gets challenged, it adapts. It's constantly, figuring out how to game the system better and better. And you'll see that the kinds of people that really kind of climb up in the ranks of society are very adept at adapting their ego to the situation, so that they can function better and be more validated in their interactions. And this is the driving mechanism. It is there to protect itself in the material world, the external existence. So you can think of the ego as just this force of nature within you that just wants to exist. It just wants to be relevant, to be recognized. And I think it's a fine thing to have hardwired into our system. It's unavoidable. Even if you blast yourself with psychedelics, eventually you will come back. You will come back to your ego one way or another. So these are our defense mechanisms. These are the ways that we respond and react and adapt. And yeah, it overrides our reality if necessary. It really defines reality as long as we're in that conscious realm, which is, as we'll talk more about, the where the need is to be able to go into the unconscious realm. So here we are. The ego does really like to be number one, and you can think of this as its kind of sole purpose, its function, as we've been talking about. So, yeah, self-protection, though, it's there for a reason, and that's what I really want to emphasize with this slide here, is that the ego is not bad. It's not your enemy. It's there to help you. And it's just when we develop a kind of toxic relationship with it that it becomes a problem. But think of it as, it's your defense mechanisms. It's your response to your experiences so that you can continue to function in the world. And its need becomes very obvious, especially if you try to take a lot of psychedelics or, do some sort of like ego detachment process on a regular basis. If you do it too much psychedelics very much will show you why you need the ego. So, but yeah, keep in mind this is what creates your conscious idea of reality, whether it's the whole reality or not. And I think keeping that in mind as much as possible is the key to not falling too deeply into the pitfalls of the ego. So we'll do a quick review here of Freud's psychoanalytic theory. The id, ego, superego will be elaborated on this, so don't try to take all this in at once, and feel free to pause at any point. But the id, it's the animalistic, animistic, instinctual, pleasure principle, childlike, lack of control. Control is not the idea here. The id's function is absolutely the opposite of that. It's just free spirited. It's just go. It's momentum. It's driven by biological impulses, desires, fears, emotions. All the raw input of energy. Present from birth, that's from a developmental standpoint. It's the first thing that develops. The ego comes later on in our lives. We have to kind of grow up to develop that more, and really kind of continues to develop. Its function is to provide energy, info, material. So like I said, it's that raw energy that just fuels everything. Ultimately does get filtered by the ego and the superego, but this really think of that again, kind of bottom up internal manifesting the external, unconscious manifesting the conscious. And the ego then, it's responsible for constructing a reality, or at least our sense of reality. True reality, though, is of course the whole thing, but the ego is very good at convincing us of one particular reality that validates itself. Um, and instead of being driven by the raw input, the raw energy, it is the maintenance, it's the filtration. It creates a sense of self that's suitable to exist in the world. And this again, yeah, develops after the id develops, so later on in life. And its function is to use the superego, which we'll talk about in a sec, to determine how to execute which id impulses. So it's sort of the executive decision maker. The superego then is really just an extension of the ego. You could really kind of clump all this together into just the ego, but Freud likes to distinguish it because it does have a lot more to do with the societal impact, yeah, morality, your interaction with other people and your place in society. It's driven then by, yeah, societal standards, morality, and develops, as you become part of culture, and potentially doesn't develop if you were to, grow up in the woods, away from society. You wouldn't have a superego, frankly. So it's kind of construction of living in a society. Yeah, so rules and structure. So for the visual learners, here's a visual model then of the id, ego, superego. Again, we'll start from the base, the internal, where everything comes from, our stimuli, the five senses, emotions, memories, all feeding into the id, the self beyond reality, what's underneath the surface. And the id alone, if it were to manifest in our conscious actions and behaviors, that's the pleasure action, impulsivity. But then, of course, we do have the ego. We always come back to the ego, and this is what balances. This is where that raw data from the id feeds into and then balances out, okay, what parts of this will be suitable for me to express myself in a way that will be sustainable in my place in community and society, my roles as a person in a family, and the roles I play in my relationships and my work, and then of course those extensions of that work, especially, but community in general, culture, society. That's the superego. The rules and the context, the expectations from the masses on how you should behave. All of that really feeds into the ego as well. And then as a result, the ideal behavior, which isn't always the case, which is why I put that offshoot from the id into pleasure action, is because sometimes there are moments where we are impulsive. If there's enough emotion, anger or sadness or fear, the ego can get bypassed. And we'll talk more what that looks like. So this is just to emphasize the concept of where we're headed here in this talk, that the ego very much plays a huge role if we allow it to create our reality, and that's really kind of where psychedelics come in, especially. But a lot of different ways to bypass the ego, to step away from it, to see the bigger picture. But essentially, under normal circumstances, if the ego is running its course, yeah, it is defining our experience of reality. It creates consistency. It creates a set of standards and rules to live by, so that frankly, we can just function, and that's why it is important. We absolutely need it. Another element of it, though, that it's really a main feature, is this sense of separateness, that I am distinct from you and everyone else, and that I am unique even amongst the billions of people on the planet, that somehow I matter. It's a fundamental part of how we exist. So again, not a bad thing. But then, yeah, material reality, that's really where it operates. And so this idea of what is, if okay, if there's a part of reality that isn't material, what is that? Well, yeah, if you take a good dose of psychedelics, you'll experience it. So by its nature, the ego is most often visible from the outside. It's the part of ourselves when we know someone's looking. This is what we're trying to show, even if there's a whole bunch under the surface that's at work. And that's what I kind of like about these memes. That it's where the ego is like paper thin, and you can almost like see there's something behind it. It's like dying to get out, but the ego is of course doing its job and covering it up and filtering certain things. But nonetheless, this is what we deal with all the time. Trying to keep the inside from getting out. So what happens then when we take psychedelics? And a lot of ways to do this, but one way or another, there's a kind of a chemical cascade of once it's in our body and passes the blood-brain barrier and starts to interact with neuronal mechanisms, the effects can be quite profound. And so here we are. Now the psychedelics are in play. And what happens? Well, this is a fairly crude model of what happens, but it at least illustrates what your conscious experience would be like if the executive functioning of the ego and the superego were taken out of the equation. Well, we would be left with a lot more of that self beyond reality, the raw information, what's under the surface. A lot of it impulsive, a little bit more chaotic, and that's okay. But again, this is a fairly crude model because the ego isn't necessarily gone completely. It can be, depending on what psychedelic you're doing and what amount, but the ego, think of it more as like it's been integrated, it's been dissolved into everything else. But what we have left over, what does that look like? And certainly from the perspective of someone, maybe a trip sitter or someone who's with you, these memes I think illustrate in a way what you see, what comes out, what makes it to the surface, and it can be quite different. Psychedelics they change very much from a fundamental level the behavior of people. And this is another model, just kind of a visual representation of how this bottom-up principle really functions. And when you look at the id at the bottom, from a Freudian perspective, but in general, again, that unconscious part of us, the internal, um, it is ultimately driving what is making it to the surface, but the ego kind of acts as this blocking mechanism that filters at least some of it out, usually most, but there's always still some that makes it to the surface. But here again, we can change this. The ego is a variable. And so if we shrink the ego, one way or another, or at the very least we disintegrate it, we allow it to not take on that executive role of controlling what makes it the surface, well, then we get a bit more of that raw data. So the big lesson here is just keep it in perspective, right? The ego then, despite what it may feel like, and I realize that some people listening to this who are just not as familiar with these methods of stepping outside the ego, a lot of this can seem kind of silly, like we're just talking about the obvious here. Like, yeah, I mean, of course, our memories and our experiences form, that the way we perceive the world. But the gift that psychedelics and these other methods offer is that it reminds us that the world, the universe, whatever, it's much bigger than just me, than just my singular perception, one of 7 billion ways of looking at the world. It's bigger than that. Depending on how you look at it, it may be obvious, but even myself as someone who, I use a lot of psychedelics, it's a big part of my life. I forget too, and that just goes to show, how integrated that part of us is. It's unavoidable. The ego is there for a reason, but let's just try to keep it in perspective. So this is just a reminder, as I talked about in the part 3, the spiritual lens of psychedelics. There's more ways to do this than just psychedelics. So on to our next model in psychology. This one definitely dips more into neurobiology, as the popularization of this theory, I believe it actually came out of neuroimaging research. Robin Carhart Harris contributed a lot to that, Imperial College London studies. But nonetheless, I think it fits well with these other models in psychology, because it parallels the dynamic between like this internal, external, id, ego kind of dynamic. But here, modeling it on a spectrum of entropy. So entropy is that idea that things tends towards disorder, towards chaos, towards abstraction. High entropy being more of that state of openness, of things just kind of going. There's no limitations. It's dwelling more in the spontaneity of thought, the abstraction. Vulnerability I put there in reference to our experience of those thoughts leaving us vulnerable, right? It creates the opportunities to be affected. Again, very, very akin to the psychedelic experience. The immaterial too, the high entropy state, the open mind, it doesn't function well in the material world, the external experience. And that's really where the limiting mind becomes useful, becomes necessary, in fact. The limiting mind is low entropy, so less disorder, less chaos, because we're focused. We're filtering out the unnecessary stuff. We're just taking the elements of our psyche that are appropriate, that kind of pass the test of what is suitable for human interaction, to exist in a society, to follow the rules, to be presentable, or at the very least to validate our sense of identity. And therefore, it's a level of protection. Again, what we've talked about that a lot, and functions linearly. It likes consistency. So this is just to emphasize the parallel nature between this entropic brain theory and the Freudian model. The primary process, secondary process being like that id and ego parts of us. Yeah, very, very much, I think, draws a nice parallel. So it draws a nice parallel too with the neurobiology. There's a good amount of research validating that when you are looking at specific regions of the brain, different tissues, you're going to find a correlation between these different states of consciousness. And then from a broader kind of neurology perspective, neuroplasticity is this idea that neurons, they can branch out, they can make more connections with other neurons to form more pathways of thinking, and more pathways of thinking is that high entropy state, the more open mind state. And on the other end of it, then you're looking at less neuroplasticity, the pruning, the just kind of sticking to the same patterns, reinforcing the same patterns of thinking and the neuronal connections. And then again, yeah, really emphasizing that dynamic between the two states, the internal, external information feeds from the high entropy to the low entropy state, the external. But then there's this top-down mechanic of suppression and filtering and modulating. So here we're just putting it all together, or just comprehensive look at all of these. And then we can look at psychedelics, where does that kind of find itself? And again, this is a crude model, I would say, because while psychedelics do usually tend towards a more high entropy, open mind state, more neuroplasticity, the low entropy state is not necessarily inaccessible. Certainly there's a level of ego validation. The egoic resistance is always at play, even if you're on psychedelics. But if we were to just compare on the right here, I have your general psychiatric meds, your antidepressants, antipsychotics, your mood stabilizers, things like that. Yeah, that's going to more likely create a state of low entropy. The mind is more filtered. There's more limitations on the mind, less connections. So let's move on to the next section here, more just kind of drawing the parallels between mental illnesses and psychedelics. So let's start with entropy theory. This again acts as a nice model, albeit a fair bit crude, because really the reality is people are far more complex than just being on one end of the spectrum or another. The reality really is we traverse the spectrum. We sometimes exist on more than one spot on the spectrum at the same time even. But as a general idea, high entropy states, these open mind states, if you're to take that to an extreme where you're developing a pathology, where there's some problems being manifested in your life, the types of mental illnesses you're looking at, your impulse disorders, mania, ADD, ADHD, acute psychosis, these are very much on that extreme end of the high entropy spectrum. And then on the other end, though, when we have too much limitation, too much filtration, we're stuck in the same patterns. That's the PTSD, the depression, anxiety, addiction, OCD. So where do psychedelics fit into this? Well, mental illness is a big problem these days. And you can see then it makes sense that we're looking in other places. The realm of psychiatric medicine has been very stagnant for about 40, 50 years. And guess what else has been stagnant? The laws around psychedelics as medicine. They've been stuck in the Schedule 1 status. But that's changing. Yeah, it's blown up very much so in the realm of depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD. So yeah, no surprise. Yeah, and we definitely see there's a lot of money going into it, a lot of research, a lot of excitement happening. So a little bit of evidence-based data here. This study in particular was looking at members of an ayahuasca church, and these are people that are using ayahuasca on a fairly regular basis, and seeing if they could correlate these neurobiological signatures of depression, anxiety, PTSD, things like that, and seeing that, yeah, in fact, folks like this who use ayahuasca on a regular basis, they definitely show signs of not being associated with these issues of too much of that limiting mind, the egoic mind, Identity formation here was measured, referential bias, so that's basically comparing yourself to other people. Transpersonal identification be much more, in that realm of going outside the ego, and then worry, constantly dwelling on the sort of what ifs, the looking towards the future, expectation bias, things like that. And in general, the quote here is no evidence of psychological maladjustment. They find the mental health deterioration, cognitive impairment very low with ayahuasca groups. So pretty interesting study. And here, more generally, we were just outlining the ego rewarding traps, the nature of the ego and its interaction with our societal conditions that very often results in just over validating, becoming too ingrained in patterns that leave us stagnant in those states of ego validation. The lack of exercise, diet, meditation, living a healthy life. We could do that, or you could just bypass that with the psychedelics, and then convince yourself that you're good. You don't need to actually follow through. And I see that a lot, unfortunately. I've seen it in myself. It's a constant battle, to be honest, because psychedelics are such a big part of my life. They very much actually validate my ego. I have a bit of the opposite issue with that. Most people that I meet, they have a resistance to psychedelics, but for me, I have to do more work to attenuate how much I put into it, because too much psychedelics, this is what happens. You can avoid the things that make your life sustainably healthy, and just go past all those defense mechanisms and identification patterns. Just go to that quick fix. So keep that in mind in terms of the dynamic between psychedelics and the ego. And isn't this quite a challenge in the society that we live in, with just endless distraction? The sex, drugs, and screens is what I like to say. These days, it really is just everywhere. You have to really go out of your way to avoid the constant pull, the seduction of media, of the highly stimulating experiences with food and drugs and entertainment. It's everywhere. It's everywhere, and this very much is going to play on those mechanisms to keep us in that limiting mind, to keep us locked in the feedback loop of avoiding the unconscious, avoiding those parts of ourselves under the surface. So here we have this cascading effect. It really is driving so much of the widespread epidemics, pandemics of psychological illnesses. And the way I look at it is, if we have these conditions in society that are so ego rewarding, and then we combine that with the focused perspectives. If you have enough people operating strictly from the basis of their egos, inevitably we're all going to disagree. We're going to have to conform to certain things just to get along. But then you combine that with the criminality of the very things that can help us step outside of that. And it's no wonder we've been on exponential rise of mental illnesses in the last few decades, especially. So yeah, could it be that banning psychedelics could have something to do with that? So thank you very much for listening to this part 4, psychedelic psychology. I hope you've taken away some sense of validation in terms of what the psychedelic experience means, and how to work with it, how to make it beneficial for you. And there's a ton more awesome content in the psychedelic harm reduction course, 12 classes altogether, each one designed to offer some really in-depth practical education on how to reduce your risks, maximize your benefits. And you can view all the slides for every class for free at openmindintegration.com. And there's a bunch of other educational content up there as well. And my personal services, of course, for people going through preparation and integration processes. Here to help. Here to help folks go a little deeper, be a little safer about it. So please let me know. Thank you.